Okay, so things that have happened that will negatively affect farming since my last video, which was 2 days ago, include: it looked like we were going to get sold down the river in an American trade agreement, which is something the DEFRA minister has publicly said he would support. And Steve Reed's contempt for us has been shown when he described his job as working in the Department of Sewage and Angry Farmers. Thanks, Steve. And also beavers. Now, I understand that beavers are very popular in metropolitan circles, but that's because those people don't have to deal with beavers. This article says Reed's plan was stalled by Number 10 because of concerns it was a Conservative legacy project that could needlessly upset farmers. It does seem to me that a lot of what Steve Reed is doing is a Conservative legacy project, which I talked about a couple of days ago. We will spend a couple of weeks looking at beavers, look at why they were hunted to extinction, hopefully go and see some beavers, talk to some ecologists about it. But I think the reason they've announced this now is because there is so much stuff going wrong that we just don't have time to talk about it. So that's one for the future. And indeed, lots of stuff is going wrong, because since these things, we saw Zelensky get yelled at in the Oval Office, which makes British involvement in a war look more likely. And our government has no plan to supply the nation with food, which could very quickly become everybody's problem. A good place to start on the enormous topic that is food security is a recent report for the National Preparedness Commission. This is an independent body that essentially looks at threats to the country and suggests ways that we could continue existing, which is generally speaking the objective of a state. This report is called Just In Case, which is a play on the just-in-time system of logistics, which is what we have now and is risky. 7 steps to narrow the UK food resilience gap, written by Tim Lang, who is a professor of food policy, and a couple of other people. They want to improve civil food resilience, which has a waffly definition, but it means they want people to be aware of threats to the food supply, they want everyone to be fed through a crisis, and they want an organised communitarian approach to this. So far, this is something that the government have completely overlooked, and I think it's similar to our system of armaments. I think we've presumed for a long time now that should there be a war, America will supply us with weapons and they will also supply us with food. But as we are seeing, there are problems with that. This report says that the Food 2030 strategy has been abandoned, as has the 2021 National Food Strategy, and the 2022 Government Food Strategy didn't really say anything. Neither the Agriculture Act 2020 or the Environment Act 2021 addressed food. One could read those acts and infer that the main point of land is protection of nature, as though food production cannot be woven into nature protection. Despite all this, food is one of 13 critical national infrastructure sectors. And that's very important. Agriculture is part of our national infrastructure. The railways transport people, water companies provide water, the National Health Service gives us medical stuff, and we provide food. All of those things were nationalised after the war because they are important to the nation. And in a similar way, agriculture was socialised, which is why we got cheap food subsidies. There appears to be a serious gap in state thinking. But it hasn't always been this way. It was this way before the First World War, but then the conflict caused the food supply to collapse. So the government enforced war agriculture through organisations called the War Ags, which they then reinstituted ahead of time before the Second World War. They put the administrative framework for these organisations back into operation in 1936 because they saw a potential threat and acted ahead of time. And today we see a threat. There is already a war in Europe that is becoming increasingly unstable thanks to our friend across the pond. We're rearming, essentially, and there's talk of deploying troops. But it's worse than this, because the food supply is failing even in peacetime, and that's before climate change gets as bad as it's going to get. Both the Conservative and Labour government seem to be drawn to a neoliberal approach to food, which sees food security as a matter of trade and supply only. This is seemingly blind to the experience of millions of people already finding household food security a real problem. Food prices are 25% higher than a few years ago. We cannot assume that providing sufficient supply from anywhere is maintained, consumption will also be fine. It's not a holistic approach. In the UK, we have chronic problems in the food system like obesity and unequal access to healthy food. And there's also acute shocks like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, trade disruption in the Middle East, COVID, and the worsening domestic harvest as climate change starts to take hold. I like this report because it has lots of words, but then succinct boxes that explain why the government are wrong. There is a danger of the UK repeating past mistakes, assuming others will always feed us, and that the state has the military and logistics capacity to maintain food normality. It might not. And some bits are quite savage as well. The food system is 6.5% of national gross value added in the economy as a whole. To some political thinkers, this suggests food is unimportant. They are wrong. Without food, existing societal and economic normality fragments. And then they provide this map which shows the intersection of all the stuff we talk about on this channel: governments, farmers, retailers, the environment, and even cultural stuff. The contribution that farms make to Englishness and to the social fabric of the nation as a whole, I think, fits in here. Point being, it's a complicated system and it's far from perfect, but it's evolved in a particular way for a reason, and the government are messing with it in a way that's going to cause unintended consequences. The report says we already have rationing based on income. Confidence in the availability of food is income related. Large numbers of the British population are technically food insecure, according to the government's own measure. The report provides a list of threats to the food system, which range from a naval blockade, we are an island, or a blockade of a trade route further afield, to ingredient shortages of popular foods. But many of these things are already happening. There is massive food inflation at the moment, driving general inflation in the UK. UK agriculture has a labour shortage. There are flooding events. In a nutshell, the British food system is already not working very well, even without a catastrophic external shock. So now we're going to rattle through the 7 steps the report proposes to stave off this looming threat of starvation. Step 1. Look at what other people have done. We should do the stuff that worked. Inform the public about how to behave and also take food seriously. Step 2. Have a look at the public's attitudes. This is nice actually. It says we need a communitarian approach to address unequal capacity. There must be an emphasis on community support, not an individualised look after yourself basis. Step 3. Know what a community can use to cook food and to grow food, to supply itself, and also avoid extreme individualism, as selfishness can exacerbate shocks. The government should have its own stockpile of food to reassure people, and that should prevent fighting in supermarkets. Step 4. Local authorities should look at public access to land and stuff like that to diversify the food supply. Empower people to produce their own food. Step 5. Have what I suppose is a bit like a war ag, but for food rather than agriculture, although they're two sides of the same coin. An organisation to deal with the food crisis. We recommend that a new local food crisis coordination system be created nationally that we call local food resilience committees. Here's a map of the proposed authority structure if you're interested. These would map the local food supply chains, as very few localities actually know where their food comes from. They would build networks of expertise and trust and be able to assess food risks in their districts and know where help is needed most. They would act as an early warning system for civil society. They would encourage place-specific food resilience, so they would look different in rural, coastal, suburban and urban areas, and they would support citizens' actions for food resilience. So these committees would be a bit like a modern and remarkably inclusive war ag, which is something I would absolutely support. This diagram shows how the local food resilience committee would get instruction from the government and then liaise with all these local groups to make the community come together and function cohesively. Step 6. The government has to stop being ridiculous and get a grip. And step 7, the government needs to reset its resilience framework for food. This involves all the stuff we've talked about so far today and should aim to democratise the food system. That's the word they use. Now this is something we could unpack. I think the point here is about decentralising the food system, which then would make it more resilient. More distributed systems, particularly logistics, are desirable. With so few companies responsible for high percentages of UK food retail, manufacturing and distribution, policymakers should take the case for diversification and appropriate regionalisation more seriously for resilience reasons. Reliance on relatively few hubs is intrinsically risk generating. And then you see from these graphs how a distributed system is going to be affected the least if the connections between one of these dots stops working, because all of the other dots will still be integrated with each other. Now, I think this democratisation or decentralisation of the food system is the same idea behind the championing of owner-occupying small farms after the war, because that's decentralised. If you have lots of small farms and something goes wrong on one of them, all of the other farms are still operational. Whereas if you have one massive factory farm and there's a catastrophic disease outbreak, say, then that's going to be a problem. But these proposals appear to me not to be trying to spread the food system more thinly within the rural community, but within the population as a whole, which is something I would support. But as much as I agree having more allotments, encouraging people to make use of their gardens, community farms, stuff like this would holistically be a good thing for people's health, the planet, our food security, our communities, people's connection to the land. I also feel that to hope that these things are the answer to our food security is perhaps wishful thinking. The reason people today generally don't grow their own vegetables or keep pigs in their back garden is because those things take a lot of time, and time is money. It's expensive to do that. Some people don't have access to gardens and other people just can't be bothered to cultivate them, which is fine. I think if the proposals in this report are to happen, which would be a good thing, we are also going to need productive agriculture as well. But nevertheless, I heartily agree with the recommendations of the report. The current just-in-time approach to food distribution and logistics should be altered to plan for shocks to the food supply. They suggest things that citizens could do to insulate themselves from these dangers, which could be as simple as gardening. So you could plant fruit trees instead of regular trees in towns. Creating new civil food resilience committees is something that we should have done years ago. And I like that it incorporates health professionals, although I would like to have seen farmers mentioned explicitly here. Land use policies, such as England's National Planning Policy Framework, should give higher priority to food production potential in and around urban areas and should accelerate the relocalisation and regionalisation of food production in a more decentralised manner. This, to emphasise, is very much the opposite of what's happening. We're seeing local abattoirs closed down, council farms are being sold off, and the Labour Party is essentially continuing the Conservative programme of removing support for agriculture while also attacking land holdings through tax. So we're going to increasingly see small family farms go out of business, and they will be replaced by operations that can industrialise and become more intensive. So we'll see more agribusinesses and we'll see more factory farms. And this will not be a good thing for the environment. So those are the proposals that have been put to the government. And within that, we have a brief overview of our government's attitude to our food supply, which is concerning. And it's not just about farmers. This is about national infrastructure. It's everybody's problem. Next, we need to have a look at where we import food from and whether those places are reliable politically and also whether they're going to be impacted by climate change going forward. In the meantime, maybe we should be setting up little community groups to grow our own food. It is a nice thought. I would happily incorporate my farm into a system like that. Provided nothing else goes catastrophically wrong in the meantime, I will be back next week. Let me know what you think below. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you then.